In 2023, Mearsheimer and Sebastian Rosato published How States Think: The Rationality of Foreign Policy, a book that defends the theory that most states act rationally most of the time. In the first chapter, The Rational Actor Assumption, the authors challenge scholars who claim there is a growing prevalence of non-rationality among state leaders. They write, "Rationality is all about making sense of the world for the purpose of navigating it in the pursuit of desired goals." The authors emphasize that both rational choice theorists and political psychologists primarily examine how individuals choose among alternative options. For the authors, rationality at the state level concerns how decision makers, a group of individuals responsible for foreign policy, collaborate to formulate goals and strategies. A state's rationality thus depends on how the views of its decision makers are aggregated. What then is strategic rationality? For Mearsheimer and Rosato, strategic rationality occurs when states' policy are grounded in credible theories and emerge from a deliberative decision-making process. In contrast to rational choice theories and political psychologists who focus on how individuals act to maximize expected utility and perform utility calculation, Mearsheimer and Rosato are more concerned with how individuals make sense of the world. This focus stems from the uncertainty and information deficiency that characterize international politics. In the second chapter, Strategic Rationality and Uncertainty, the authors examine a key requirement of rational thinking, an active approach to information gathering that continues even after reaching an initial conclusion. Rational actors, they argue, must be willing to reconsider and update their beliefs in light of new, incomplete information. Policymakers are often required to make decisions in a world characterized by uncertainty, and strategic rationality demands flexibility on ongoing reassessment. To illustrate their argument, the authors cite several historical examples, including U.S. policy towards Europe after World War II, American policy toward East Asia after the Cold War, Japanese policy before Pearl Harbor, and American policy during the Cuban Missile Crisis. In the latter case, U.S. foreign policy blended military preparedness with diplomatic negotiation, aiming to eliminate the Soviet threat from Cuba while avoiding nuclear conflict. This approach reflected Cold War strategic thinking, firm but not reckless, and strong yet guided by diplomacy. In the third chapter, Defining Strategic Rationality, the authors emphasize the importance of theoretical thinking in navigating the uncertain world of international politics. Theorizing involves developing logically consistent explanations based on empirically verified assumptions and testing those explanations against observable facts. Policymakers rely on theories to craft strategies and manage crises, and for these theories to be useful, they must be credible. Credible theories are grounded in clear assumptions, coherent causal logic, and supported by empirical evidence, though they may still face evidentiary challenges. Among such theories, the authors highlight defensive realism, which argues that war rarely pays because it's generally easier to defend than to attack. Still, this theory recognizes that states may act aggressively to enhance their power or dominate the international system. They also discuss offensive realism, which contends that the structure of the international system pushes intense competition among states, since aggression can sometimes be rewarded. This theory holds that states are constantly seeking opportunities to shift the balance of power in their favor. In contrast, non-credible theories rest on unrealistic assumptions, lack logical inconsistencies, and have little evidentiary support for their causal logics. For example, racial theories posit a biologically rooted racial hierarchy among people and nations. Finally, the authors criticize non-theoretical thinking, which occurs when policymakers rely primarily on raw data or emotion-driven thinking. In the fourth chapter, Contending Definitions, the authors detail why expected utility maximization approach is an inadequate and ultimately non-rational way to understand decision-making in international politics. The international system, they argue, is not an information-rich, certain or risk-based environment, but rather one marked by uncertainty and limited information. As such, expected utility maximization offers a flawed definition of individual rationality in world politics. It does not reflect the actual mental processes by which rational policy makers make sense of their environment or determine how to act. In conditions of uncertainty, different policy makers may reach different judgments while still acting rationally. This means that rationality does not imply the existence of a single, objectively best choice in every situation. In contrast to political psychologists who often view analogies and heuristics as sources of bias and irrationality, Mearsheimer and Rosato argue that policymakers rely on such cognitive tools to process complex information. These shortcuts are not signs of irrationality, but necessary strategies for coping with cognitive limitations in a demanding decision-making environment. In the fifth chapter, Rationality and Grand Strategy, the authors study 5 cases in which states acted rationally because their policy makers were guided by credible theories and their policies emerged from deliberative decision-making. The first one is Germany's decision to confront the Triple Entente, France, Russia, and Britain, before World War I. Feeling threatened by the rising power of these countries, Germany adopted a strategy of preemptive war to ensure its survival. The second case is Japan's decision to attack the United States at Pearl Harbor in the lead-up to World War II. Japan aimed to maximize its security by weakening American power and securing access to vital resources, while maintaining neutrality with the Soviet Union to avoid fighting on 2 fronts. The third example is France's strategy of dealing with the Nazi threat before World War II. France built the Maginot Line designed to stop a direct German attack. However, the strategy was largely defensive and reactive, based on the assumption that Germany would attack in a predictable manner. France's defeat ultimately enabled Germany to shift its focus to the Soviet Union, which it invaded to secure resources and eliminate a growing threat. The fourth case concerns the United States' decision to expand NATO after the Cold War, responding to the collapse of the Soviet Union. The U.S. decision to settle the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962 is also considered rational, given the bipolar nature of the international system at the time. The final case is the United States' pursuit of liberal hegemony after the Cold War. This strategy was seen as rational in much the same way that the Soviet Union's invasion of Czechoslovakia in 1968 was. Both sought to preserve dominance, liberal in the US case, communist in the Soviet case, and to prevent fragmentation within their respective spheres of influence. In the sixth chapter, Rationality and Crisis Management, the authors revisit the same examples cited in chapter 5 to explore the question of rationality in crisis situations. They reference scholars who consider certain historical decisions to be irrational in order to defend their own perspectives. The first case, Germany's decision to start World War I, is considered irrational by Richard Nell-Lebeau. He argues that German leaders relied on false analogies, believing the 1914 crisis would mirror the 1909 Bosnian crisis, during which Germany and Austria-Hungary successfully pressured Russia and Serbia to accept Vienna's annexation of Bosnia-Herzegovina without conflict. According to Lebeau and Janis Grostein, the Germans were driven by emotions. However, Mearsheimer and Rosato contend that Germany's decision was both deliberate and grounded in credible theories. They point out that German leaders were aware of the risks, especially given the increasing lethality of modern weaponry, which made them adopt a more defensive posture rather than an offensive one. The second case of Japan's decision to attack the United States at Pearl Harbor, often interpreted as irrational. Lebeau and Stein suggest this was an example of wishful thinking, while Jeffrey Record attributes it to Japan's racism, fatalism, imperial arrogance, and cultural ignorance. Mearsheimer and Rosato counter that, although Japan's chances of success were slim, its leaders preferred a risky war over economic collapse due to measures like the oil embargo. Thus, they argue the decision was based on credible realist reasoning. Germany's invasion of the Soviet Union is also widely regarded as Hitler's personal decision taken against the advice of his generals, a view supported by Alex Schulman, Noren Ripsman, Jeffrey Taliaferro, and others. The authors disagree, arguing that Germany sought European hegemony and saw the Soviet Union as vulnerable at the time, with the Red Army weaker than the Wehrmacht. Ideological and racial motivations such as fascist beliefs and the perception of Slavs and Jews as inferior were secondary to strategic considerations. The U.S. handling of the Cuban Missile Crisis is likewise seen by some scholars, including Noam Chomsky, James Nathan, and Mark Haas, as irrational. The authors reject this interpretation. They argue that President Kennedy quickly concluded that a full-scale assault could neutralize the threat, but he ultimately opted for coercive diplomacy. This strategy gave the Soviets the choice to either remove their missiles from Cuba in exchange for a U.S. promise not to invade, or accept a mutual de-escalation with the removal of American Jupiter missiles from Turkey. These options were actively debated by U.S. leaders. Finally, the Soviet Union's invasion of Czechoslovakia is often viewed by NATO and some scholars as a non-rational act. The authors dispute this, asserting that the Prague Spring and the rise of Alexander Dubček as first secretary of the Communist Party, along with Antonin Novotny's liberal reforms as president, were perceived by Moscow as a serious threat. In response, the Soviets engaged in deliberate decision-making, holding meetings, conferences, and plenary sessions while continuing to gather intelligence. Between July 19 and 27, they began planning the invasion, though they also pursued diplomatic efforts backed by military pressure. The seventh chapter, Non-Rational State Behavior. The authors argue that states do occasionally make irrational decisions. According to them, non-rationality can take one of three forms. Decision makers either use a non-credible theory or a non-theoretical argument without deliberation. They rely on a credible theory but engage in a non-deliberative policy-making process, or they employ a non-credible theory or a non-theoretical argument but do deliberate. For example, before World War I, Germany sought to expand its naval power by the end of the 19th century. Chancellor Otto von Bismarck appointed Admiral Alfred von Tirpitz to lead the expansion of the German Navy. Tirpitz promoted two naval laws. The first mandated a fleet of 19 battleships organized into two squadrons. The second aimed to double this to 38 battleships organized into 4 squadrons. The second naval law was based on Tirpitz's risk theory, which argued that Germany should focus primarily on Britain rather than France and Russia as its main maritime threat. However, this theory was non-credible as it contradicted the well-established balance of power theory, which predicts that states respond to increases in rivals' capabilities by balancing against them, often forming alliances. Tirpitz wrongly assumed Britain would not respond by balancing, and he failed to deliberate adequately with other government leaders. Another example is Britain's no-liability strategy before World War II. After Hitler came to power, Germany became a threat to Britain. To deter Germany, Britain pursued 3 different policies across 3 periods. From November 1933 to May 1937, a limited liability strategy called for creating a field force to aid France. From May 1937 to September 1938, Britain adopted a no liability at all stance, deciding that France should handle Germany aggression alone. And from October 1938 to April 1939, Britain reverted to full liability, pledging to send a 5-division field force if Germany attacked France. The authors argue that Britain acted rationally during the first and third periods, but not the second. The authors also discussed the U.S. decision to invade Cuba. Under President Eisenhower, the plan was to destroy the Cuban Air Force and invade with a brigade of U.S.-trained Cuban exiles. When Kennedy came to office, he approved a revised plan, moving the landing site to the Bay of Pigs and scheduling a night attack. This plan was non-rational. The exiled pilots were poorly trained, flying outdated and poorly maintained planes. Only 20% of the 1,500 troops had military experience, and the invading force was heavily outnumbered. Cuba was aware of the attack and prepared accordingly. The operation was based on an uncredible theory of victory and was non-deliberative. Finally, the U.S. decision to invade Iraq is examined. President Bush aimed to address terrorism and nuclear proliferation in the Middle East, with the goal of democratizing the region based on the democratic peace theory, which holds that democracies do not fight each other. The U.S. launched sudden and massive airstrikes against Iraqi targets, followed by ground assaults. Bush believed that post-defeat Iraq would be easy to democratize, anticipating a domino effect of democratic reform in neighboring states. The authors argued that while the democratic peace theory and victory theory were credible, the theory of democracy promotion and the domino theory were not. Historical examples like Panama show that forcibly imposing democracy often fails, and the Cuban Revolution did not spread communism regionally as feared. Moreover, the invasion decision process was non-deliberative. In Chapter 8, Goal Rationality, and Chapter 9, Rationality in International Politics, the authors emphasized that the primary goal of every state is survival. In other words, all other goals must be subordinated to survival. This means that any state or actor that does not prioritize survival as their main objective is acting irrationally. The argument that property or wealth is more important than survival is deemed irrational by the authors. They contend that prosperity is secondary to survival because nations seek to maximize their wealth primarily to avoid extinction.